The Silence in the House at Night, Chapter 1. The Unremarkable Night. A man wakes at 2:13 a.m. No alarm brought him here. No sound from another room. No television left running in the den. No footsteps overhead. No door closing down the hall. The refrigerator compressor clicks off. The heating system settles with a low metallic tick. Somewhere inside the wall, a pipe shifts once, then holds still. He lies there for a few seconds. Not because anything is wrong. Because the house has become so quiet that every small sound now seems deliberate, like each one is announcing itself before stepping back into nothing. He looks toward the bedroom door. Open. Dark hallway beyond it. No second lamp glowing on the other side of the bed. No movement in the bathroom. No voice from the next room asking, "You up?" He gets out of bed, walks to the kitchen, fills a glass from the tap, and drinks standing at the sink. The house is clean. Paid for or close to it. Orderly. The counters are wiped. The garbage was taken out before he went to bed. The thermostat is set where he wants it. The doors are locked. Nothing is broken tonight. On paper, nothing about this scene suggests instability. And yet, there is a quality to the silence at this hour that daylight never quite produces. During the day, there are tasks, calls, errands, noise from the street, the sound of his own activity filling the rooms. The house is a workspace during the day. It is a tool. It cooperates. At night, the house stops cooperating. It simply exists. And in that existence, it begins to reflect something back that the daytime version does not. Not loneliness, not sadness, something more structural than either of those. It reflects the fact that he is the only operating system in this building. From the outside, this life reads as control. A quiet house suggests peace. A man who answers to no one suggests freedom. A man who built an entire adult life without marital dependence suggests competence. Maybe even a kind of discipline that others quietly admire but rarely mention. The cultural reading of this arrangement is simple and in its own way flattering. He avoided complications. He kept his options. He protected his time and his money. He maintained authority over his own space. He did not get tangled in the kind of domestic negotiations that drain other men his age. People who know him casually tend to view this life through one of two lenses. Either they see a man who is smart enough to stay free, or they see a man who is unlucky in a way they are too polite to name. The first reading respects him. The second one pities him. Both are incomplete, because neither reading asks the question that the house itself is asking at 2 in the morning. The house is not asking whether he is happy. It is asking whether this structure has a backup. Stand here in this kitchen long enough, at this hour, and the question sharpens. If something happened right now, a fall, a cardiac event, a stroke, a sudden confusion, how long before anyone would know? Not because no one cares. People probably do care in a general sense. A brother, a coworker, a friend from years back who checks in occasionally, maybe a neighbor who would notice the mail accumulating after a few days. But notice the phrase, after a few days. The gap between incident and detection in this house is not measured in minutes. It is not measured in hours. It is measured in the interval between expected external contact, which, for many men living this way, can stretch remarkably long without triggering any alarm. That is not a commentary on his character. It is a commentary on his architecture. Here is where the first quiet shift occurs. Independence, viewed from inside, feels like a permanent personal quality. He has always handled things himself. He has always figured it out. He has always been the one who did not need to be reminded, managed, supervised, or checked on. That identity is real. It was built through decades of functioning, and it has earned a certain confidence that is not arrogant but operational. He knows what he can do. He knows what he has done. He does not require external validation to believe in his own competence. But competence and redundancy are not the same thing. A bridge can be engineered brilliantly, every beam calculated, every joint precise, every load distributed with care. But if the entire structure depends on a single support column that cannot be replaced or reinforced, the engineering does not matter once that column is compromised. The man standing in this kitchen is the single support column of his own life. He is the one who tracks the medications. He is the one who notices the leak under the sink. He is the one who reads the insurance documents, who remembers when the property tax is due, who knows which drawer holds the car title. He keeps the passwords. He schedules the appointments. He recognizes when something feels wrong inside his own body and decides whether it warrants attention. No one else holds any of that information, not because he refused to share it, but because there was never a structural reason to. The arrangement never required a second operator. Until the question becomes, what happens when the single operator is interrupted? This is not about loneliness. That word gets used too quickly, too loosely, and almost always with an emotional charge that misses the real issue. Loneliness is a feeling. It rises and falls. It can be managed, tolerated, ignored, or genuinely absent, depending on temperament and circumstance. What the house is revealing at this hour is not a feeling. It is a designed fact. This life has no relational redundancy. No second set of ears in the next room. No one noticing the missed dose, the unusual delay, the unopened letter that should have been opened 3 days ago. No one hearing the change in breathing that started last month. No one seeing that the stairs take longer now. No one noticing the car has a new dent he does not remember making, or that the same meal has been eaten 4 nights in a row, not by choice, but because planning is narrowed. These are not emergencies. They are the small, continuous signals that a life is either holding steady or beginning to shift. In a household with more than one person, these signals get picked up almost accidentally. A passing comment, a glance, a question asked not out of suspicion, but out of proximity. In a solitary house, those signals go to no one. They enter the silence, and the silence absorbs them without response. There is a particular kind of man who will hear all of this and feel his guard rise. Good. That guard exists for a reason. It exists because he has spent years, maybe decades, being subtly told that his life is a problem to be solved. That living alone past 50 without having married is a deficiency. That something must be wrong, must be missing, must be buried or broken or avoided. He has heard it from relatives who ask careful questions at holidays. He has heard it from coworkers who assume he must be lonely on weekends. He has heard it from a culture that treats coupled life as the default and everything else as a deviation requiring explanation. So his guard is not irrational. It is a defense built from experience. And nothing in what follows is designed to dismantle that defense. This is not therapy. This is not a self-help program dressed in a calm voice. This is not going to tell him what he should feel, or what he should have done, or what kind of life is correct. What this is instead is a structural examination, like walking through a building with an engineer, not to condemn the building, not to call it ugly or outdated, but to look at the load-bearing walls, the wiring, the plumbing, the foundation, and ask where the concentrated stress points are. Every building has them. A building with one occupant has them in specific, predictable places. That is all this is. The man finishes his water, sets the glass by the sink, stands there another moment. Maybe he looks out the window. Maybe he checks his phone for the time. Maybe he walks back through the hallway and pauses at the second bedroom, the one that became an office, or a storage room, or a space that never became anything at all because there was never a reason to decide. Then he goes back to bed. In the morning, he will get up and resume. The house will fill again with the sounds of function, coffee, shower, the news or a podcast, the familiar sequence that carries the day forward. And during the day, the question the house asked at 2 a.m. will recede. It will not press. It will not insist. It will simply wait, as structural questions always do, for the next moment of quiet. Because here is what the silence has actually surfaced, even if he is not ready to examine it yet. A quiet house does not only reflect peace, it reveals how much of a life depends on one man remaining continuously functional. Not happy, not fulfilled, not emotionally whole, functional. And that single word carries more weight at 53 or 58 or 62 than it did at 35. Because at 35, functional was nearly automatic. The body cooperated. The mind was fast. The future was abstract enough that structural questions about late life continuity seemed premature, almost ridiculous. At 50 plus, functional is no longer automatic. It is maintained. And it is maintained by the same person who depends on it most. So the opening question is not whether this man is lonely. The opening question is this: if a house can be stable and still be structurally exposed, then what else in this life has been mistaken for strength simply because it has never yet been tested? That question will not be answered quickly. It should not be. It deserves the same patience and seriousness that went into building the life it examines. But it is the question that the silence asks every night, whether he is listening or not. Chapter 2, Surface Stability. The man who lives this way did not arrive here by accident. That needs to be said clearly, because the outside world almost never says it. The outside world tends to treat the never-married man past 50 as either a mystery or a cautionary tale. Something must have gone wrong. Something must have been avoided. There must be a wound somewhere, a failure, a fear that calcified into permanent solitude. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it is not. And in most cases, the truth is more ordinary and more dignified than either version. What usually happened is simpler than tragedy. A series of decisions, each one reasonable at the time, accumulated into a structure. No single moment defined it. No single relationship failed catastrophically enough to explain it. No single fear operated as the master switch. Instead, life moved. Work absorbed years. Relationships came and went with varying degrees of seriousness. Some ended because of geography. Some ended because of timing. Some ended because the fit was wrong in ways that only became clear after enough time had passed to make correction feel expensive. And at a certain point, not a dramatic point, not a visible point, often not even a conscious point, the structure of solitary living stopped being temporary and became architecture. The man did not wake up one morning and decide he would live alone forever. He simply noticed, at some point in his 40s or early 50s, that the way he was living had become the way he lived. The routines were set. The home was arranged. The finances were organized around one. The habits of daily life had hardened into a shape that no longer easily accommodated a second person. Not because he was opposed, but because the mold had already dried. There is a competence to this life that deserves serious acknowledgement before anything else is examined. The never-married man past 50 who has maintained a household, held employment, managed finances, and navigated decades of adult life without a domestic partner has done something that requires sustained operational discipline. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the kind of thing that goes unrecognized precisely because it produces no visible drama. Bills are paid, not because someone reminded him, because he built a system and maintained it. The house is kept, not because it was divided into shared responsibilities, because he handled all of it himself. The yard, the repairs, the cleaning, the maintenance schedule that exists only in his head. Meals happen. Maybe they are simple. Maybe the same rotation appears more often than a nutritionist would prefer. But the man feeds himself, manages his kitchen, and does not rely on someone else to make that function operate. Medical appointments get scheduled. Insurance gets renewed. Taxes get filed. The car gets inspected. The roof gets patched. The gutters get cleaned, or he calls someone to clean them. The furnace filter gets changed. Maybe not always on time, but the system runs. This is domestic competence executed at full scope by one person. In a two-person household, this work gets divided. Not always evenly, not always fairly, but divided nonetheless. One person handles the money, the other handles the scheduling. One tracks medical needs, the other manages home repair. One remembers the insurance renewal, the other notices the dripping faucet. In a one-person household, all of it converges on a single point, and that single point has been performing successfully for decades. So before anything else is said about risk or exposure or structural vulnerability, this fact stands on its own. The life works. It has been working. A man has made it work through sustained effort that the world rarely credits, because the world only notices domestic competence when it fails. There is a lean quality to this life that other people sometimes envy without understanding. The never-married household tends to operate with less friction, fewer negotiations over temperature, over spending, over weekend plans, over whose family to visit, over how clean is clean enough, over when to go to bed and when to get up. There is no ongoing negotiation with another adult's preferences, moods, needs, or schedules. Time belongs to one person. Space belongs to one person. Decisions about what to eat, what to watch, when to sleep, when to leave the house, how to spend a Saturday, all of it flows through a single authority. This is not selfishness. It is operational simplicity. And for a man who values clarity, who finds comfort in predictability, who has learned over decades that his own judgment is generally reliable, this simplicity is not a consolation prize. It is a genuine structural preference. He is not making the best of a bad situation. He is, in many respects, living inside a system he finds efficient and coherent. Other men his age, men in long marriages, men with children, men embedded in layered domestic obligations, sometimes look at this life and see something they quietly wish they had. Less noise, less obligation, less compromise. A house that stays the way you left it. That admiration, when it surfaces, is not wrong. It reflects something real about what solitary structure provides. But admiration is a poor diagnostic tool, because the same qualities that produce efficiency also produce concentration. And concentration, in any system, is the precursor to fragile failure. Consider how this works in any other domain. A small business run by a single owner with no employees can be remarkably efficient. Decisions are fast. Overhead is low. There is no miscommunication, no internal politics, no management drag. The operation hums because one mind controls everything. But if that owner gets sick for 2 weeks, the business does not slow down gradually. It stops because there is no one else who knows how it runs. No one else who holds the vendor contacts, the customer relationships, the account passwords, the operational logic that lives only inside one person's head. The business did not fail because it was poorly run. It failed because its excellence depended on one uninterrupted presence. This is concentration risk, and it does not only apply to businesses. A household works the same way. When one person manages everything, finances, health decisions, home maintenance, legal paperwork, insurance, food, medication, scheduling, and that person does it well, the arrangement appears robust. It appears more robust, in some ways, than a shared household where responsibilities are divided unevenly and arguments about who forgot what create visible friction. But the frictionless system has a hidden cost. It has no challenge function. No one asks, "Did you already pay that?" No one says, "That letter looked important. Did you open it?" No one notices, "You've been taking that medication at the wrong time." No one observes, You seem more tired than usual. Have you mentioned that to your doctor? These are not acts of love, necessarily. They are acts of proximity. They happen in shared households almost without intention, the way a second pair of eyes catches a typo that the writer has read past 6 times. In a solitary household, the typo stays, not because the man is careless, because the man is the only reader. This is the point where the word independence needs to be examined with more precision than it usually receives. Independence, as a cultural value, carries deep weight for American men, particularly men who came of age in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. The message was clear and pervasive. A man who needs nothing from others is strong. A man who asks for help is diminished. A man who manages his own life without external support is demonstrating the purest form of adult capability. That message was not entirely wrong. Self-reliance does produce real skills. It builds problem-solving capacity, financial discipline, emotional regulation under pressure, and the ability to function without external motivation. These are not trivial traits. They are, in many professional and personal contexts, exactly what separates men who endure from men who collapse. But the message was incomplete, because self-reliance, taken far enough and long enough, can become something other than strength. It can become a structural identity, a load-bearing wall inside the man's sense of self that resists modification even when modification would increase stability. For many never-married men past 50, independence is no longer just a preference or a practical arrangement. It has become moral architecture. It is not merely how they live. It is evidence of who they are. Not relying on others has become proof of maturity, proof of discipline, proof that they did not build a life around emotional need, proof that they remained intact while others compromised, settled, or collapsed into dependency. This is not vanity. It is identity, and identity resists revision in a way that preferences do not. A man can change a preference with moderate discomfort. He can decide he no longer prefers a certain restaurant, a certain brand, a certain neighborhood. Preference is flexible because it sits near the surface. But identity sits deeper. And when independence is identity, then anything that suggests needing others can feel like something worse than inconvenience. It can feel like demotion, like admitting that the structure he built, the structure he was quietly proud of, was insufficient all along. That is why structural analysis matters more than emotional appeal here. A man who has built his self-respect around non-dependence will not respond to being told he needs people. He will not be moved by sentimentality. He will not be persuaded by a warm voice suggesting that vulnerability is beautiful. But he may listen to a structural argument, not because he is cold, but because structure is the language in which he has always operated. So let the structural argument continue. The life functions. That has been established. The competence is real. The order is real. The operational discipline is genuinely impressive in ways the world rarely acknowledges. But there is a difference between a system that works and a system that is resilient. A working design continues to produce expected output under current conditions. The bills get paid. The house stays maintained. health is managed, routines hold. A resilient design continues to produce acceptable output under disrupted conditions. When the operator is sick, when cognition changes, when an unexpected legal question arises, when a financial anomaly occurs that requires a second perspective, when the body begins to impose limits that the mind has not yet accepted. The solitary household, as currently designed, is a working system. Whether it is a resilient arrangement is a separate question, and the answer to that question does not depend on how capable the man is today. It depends on what happens when today's capability is no longer guaranteed. The culture does not help him see this clearly. The culture rewards the image of the self-sufficient man and asks very few follow-up questions. If the house looks good, if the job is stable, if the bills are current, if the man seems composed, then the cultural verdict is favorable. He is doing fine. He has it together. He is one of those men who figured it out without all the complications. No one asks what the house looks like at 2 a.m. No one asks who would know if the man did not answer his phone for 3 days. No one asks who holds the second key, not to the front door, but to the administrative life inside. And the man himself may not ask these questions either, not because he is avoiding them, but because nothing in his environment prompts them. The arrangement provides no feedback that would indicate a problem. The lights stay on, the water runs, the mortgage gets paid, the refrigerator is stocked, the lawn gets mowed. Everything is fine. Everything has been fine for years. And fine for years is one of the most reliable indicators that a structural vulnerability has not yet been tested. Not that it does not exist, but that the conditions required to reveal it have simply not arrived. A life can be orderly for decades and still be fragile in one specific way. Everything works because one person continues to work. Remove the person from the equation through illness, through cognitive change, through injury, through any of the interruptions that late life does not ask permission to deliver. And the question is not whether the life was well built. The question is whether anyone else can read the blueprint. Whether anyone else knows which accounts exist and where. Whether anyone else can identify which medications are current and which were discontinued. Whether anyone else understands the logic behind the filing system. The reason the second bedroom door stays closed, the arrangement of the workshop, the location of the documents that matter. Whether anyone else could walk into this house and within a reasonable time frame, understand how this man's life actually operates. In most cases, the honest answer is no. Not because he hid anything, but because he never needed to explain it. The system was built for one. It runs on one. And it has never been translated into a language that anyone else could use. That is not a flaw in his character. It is a flaw in the design, and the design was not malicious. It was simply the natural result of building an entire life around the assumption that the builder would always be present to operate it. That assumption held for a long time. At 50 plus, it begins to carry weight it was never meant to bear. There is a specific hour when this becomes most legible. Not during business hours, when the phone might ring, when a coworker might send a message, when the rhythm of obligation creates at least the appearance of interconnection. And not during the early evening, when dinner preparations or television or the habit of a walk can fill the rooms with just enough activity to prevent the question from forming. The hour is somewhere between midnight and 4 in the morning. That is when the house stops performing and simply reports. During the day, the house is a participant in the man's routine. It responds to him. He opens cabinets and they open. He turns on lights and they illuminate. He walks through rooms and they accommodate his passage. The relationship is functional, reciprocal, and entirely under his control. At night, the house becomes passive. It stops responding and starts reflecting. And what it reflects is the answer to a question no one has asked out loud. What is the minimum viable network surrounding this life? In most lives, the answer to that question is layered. There is a partner, or a roommate, or an adult child, or a parent still living, or at least a daily routine that involves another human being at close range. The minimum viable network includes at least one person whose own daily rhythm is physically intertwined with the man's. In this house, the minimum viable network may be a phone contact list and a mailbox that someone would eventually notice had overfilled. That gap between what most lives contain and what this one contains is not a measure of quality. It is a measure of exposure. And exposure does not care whether the life inside is happy or unhappy, rich or modest, disciplined or chaotic. Exposure simply describes how long a deviation from normal can persist before it is registered by someone outside the house. The man may not think in these terms. He may never have had occasion to. But the house thinks in these terms every night, in the only language available to empty rooms: silence, duration, and the distance between the last sound and the next one. Chapter 3. Structural Exposure. There is a man somewhere in this country, there are, in fact, thousands of him, who last saw a doctor 14 months ago. The visit was routine. Blood pressure, cholesterol, a brief conversation about sleep. The doctor asked if anything had changed. He said no. The doctor said the numbers looked acceptable. He left. Between that visit and tonight, several things have shifted. His left knee has started to ache in a way it did not before. Not badly, and not enough to limp, but enough that he now takes the stairs differently, favoring the right side, gripping the railing in a way that would have seemed unnecessary 2 years ago. He has noticed that he reads the same paragraph twice more often than he used to. Not because the material is complex, because his focus slides in a way it did not slide at 45. He wakes more frequently at night, not from pain and not from anxiety exactly, from a kind of low-grade alertness that seems to have no source and no resolution. His appetite has narrowed, not dramatically, but the range of what he prepares for himself has contracted. 3 or 4 meals now rotate through the week, partly convenience, partly because the effort of planning something different has begun to feel disproportionate to the reward. None of these changes would alarm a physician if reported accurately. None of them, taken alone, constitute a medical event. They are the ordinary modulations of a body moving through its 6th decade, each one minor enough to dismiss, to normalize, to file under getting older. And that is exactly what he has done. Because there is no one in the house to notice the pattern. This is where the missing second observer begins to matter in concrete terms. In a shared household, the second observer is not a medical professional. The second observer is simply someone who is present on a recurring basis with enough familiarity to detect change over time. A spouse who says, "You're favoring that knee again." A partner who notices the reading glasses come out earlier in the evening. A roommate who mentions that the cough has lasted longer than usual. A sibling who visits regularly enough to see that the gait has changed since last month. These observations are not clinical. They are ambient. They arise from proximity, not from expertise. And they function as an early warning system that operates below the threshold of conscious monitoring. The man living alone does not have this system. He has self-assessment. And self-assessment, while necessary, is limited in a specific way. It relies on the same mind that is potentially changing to accurately evaluate whether change has occurred. A man whose cognition is shifting slightly will often be the last person to identify that shift. Not because he is in denial, because the instrument doing the measuring is the same instrument being measured. The ruler is shrinking along with the thing it is trying to quantify. This is not a dramatic failure. It is an ordinary limitation of any single observer apparatus. It is why financial audits require external review. It is why aircraft maintenance requires inspection by someone other than the pilot. It is why peer review exists in science. The principle is simple and has nothing to do with trust or competence. A closed loop that monitors itself with no external reference point will normalize its own drift. In a body, this means that gradual changes in energy, mobility, cognition, mood, sleep, appetite, balance, and reaction time can be absorbed into the man's self-concept as simply how things are now. Each small decrement gets incorporated into the new normal. And because no one else is tracking the original baseline, the distance between where he was and where he is grows without being measured. There is a specific kind of courage in managing health alone that goes entirely unrecognized. The man who drives himself to a medical procedure and drives himself home. The man who sits in a waiting room before a scan and has no one to text, or chooses not to text anyone, because the vulnerability of admitting concern feels more costly than the discomfort of sitting with it alone. The man who receives ambiguous test results and processes them privately over a weekend, deciding on his own how seriously to take them, how much follow-up to schedule, how much worry to authorize. This is not stoicism as performance. It is stoicism as infrastructure. It is the only available response when the emotional processing system is a closed loop. And it works well enough most of the time. The procedure happens. The results are absorbed. The follow-up gets scheduled or it does not. Life continues. But the closed loop has a cost that becomes more visible over time. Decisions made in isolation tend to compress toward inaction. When there is no one to say, "You should really get that checked," the threshold for action rises. The cough has to last longer. The pain has to become more persistent. The fatigue has to interfere with function, not just comfort, before it earns a response. This is not negligence. It is economics. In a one-man operation, every health concern competes with every other demand for the same limited resource, his attention and initiative. And because no one else is adding weight to the medical side of the scale tips more easily toward deferral. One more month. See if it resolves. Probably nothing. These are rational sentences. They are also, cumulatively, the mechanism by which treatable conditions become entrenched ones. Consider how this plays out across a single year. In January, he notices a persistent tightness in his chest after climbing stairs. He attributes it to the cold air. In March, the tightness has not resolved, but it has not worsened either, so it settles into the background. In June, he skips the annual physical because work is busy and he already knows what they will say. In September, the tightness has been joined by a fatigue that arrives earlier in the afternoon than it used to. He adjusts by going to bed earlier. In November, he mentions the chest tightness to a friend in passing, almost as an afterthought. The friend says he should get it checked. He agrees. He does not schedule the appointment before the holidays. In January again, the cycle completes. The tightness is now 14 months old. It has been witnessed by exactly one person for approximately 30 seconds during an unrelated conversation. In a household with a second observer, the January tightness would have been mentioned over breakfast. The March persistence would have prompted a direct question. The skipped June physical would have been challenged. The September fatigue would have been named aloud by someone other than the man himself. And by October, the appointment would have been made, not by the man possibly, but by or at the insistence of someone who had been watching the accumulation from close range. The difference is not dramatic. It is temporal. It is the difference between a 14-month lag and a 3-month lag, between a condition that has had time to entrench and a condition caught while intervention is still routine. And that temporal difference, multiplied across all the small health signals a body produces in a given decade, constitutes one of the largest invisible costs of solitary living. Not the cost of dramatic medical failure, the cost of delayed medical awareness, repeated across hundreds of signals that were each too small to act on alone, but that, in aggregate, define the trajectory of a man's physical decline. Now expand this beyond the body. The same pattern, single observer, no external calibration, normalization of drift, operates in every domain of the solitary household. Consider the mail. A man who lives alone processes his own mail. He sorts it, he discards the junk. He opens what seems important. He files what needs filing. He acts on what requires action. But mail volume has changed over the past 2 decades. Some of what arrives is genuinely important. Some of it is deliberately confusing, redesigned statements, altered terms, notices buried inside marketing language. And the task of distinguishing signal from noise in a stack of paper and digital notifications is cognitive work that accumulates quietly. In a 2-person household, this work gets distributed. One person notices the unusual letter. The other asks about it. A brief conversation produces a second scan, not because either person is more competent, because 2 passes catch what one pass misses. In a one-person household, the single pass is the only pass. And when that pass happens at the end of a workday, when attention is lower, when the male is competing with dinner and fatigue, and the low desire to simply be done with obligations, some things get missed. A policy change that should have been reviewed. A beneficiary form that should have been updated. A statement that shows an unfamiliar charge. An enrollment deadline that arrives disguised as routine correspondence. None of these are catastrophic in the moment. Each one is a small informational gap, but gaps accumulate. And in a life where no one else reviews the gaps, accumulation happens silently. Now consider the finances more directly. The never-married man who has managed his own money for decades often has a clearer picture of his financial position than many men in shared households. He knows what he earns. He knows what he spends. He knows what he owes and what he owns. There is no ambiguity introduced by a second spender, no friction over discretionary purchases, no debate about savings rate. This clarity is real, and it is an advantage. But clarity is not the same as security. Financial security requires not only understanding, but continuity. It requires that the understanding persist even when the person who holds it is interrupted. And in a solitary financial structure, continuity depends entirely on one mind remaining sharp, one filing system remaining current, one set of login credentials remaining accessible, one understanding of account structure remaining accurate. There is no second person who knows the accountant's name, no one who remembers which brokerage holds the retirement account, no one who has seen the most recent beneficiary designation, no one who understands why the money is allocated the way it is, not just where it sits, but the reasoning behind the arrangement. This is not about the amount of money. A man can have modest assets or significant ones and face the same structural problem. The problem is not poverty. The problem is opacity. A financial life managed by one person becomes, over time, a private language. Every decision has context that lives inside one head. The reason for keeping that particular account open, the reason for the annual transfer, the reason for the specific insurance product, the reason the will says what it says, or the reason there is no will at all. When that man is no longer available to translate, whether through death, incapacity, hospitalization, or cognitive decline, the financial structure does not become empty. It becomes unreadable. And unreadable financial structures do not protect wealth. They consume it. Through delays, through legal proceedings, through administrative friction, through the sheer cost of reconstructing a picture that one man held complete in his mind and never transferred to paper or to another person. There is a specific resistance many men in this position feel when the topic of financial planning comes up. It is not resistance to planning itself. Most of these men are, in fact, better planners than average. They have to be. The entire structure depends on their foresight. The resistance is to the implication that planning must involve others, because involving others means explaining. And explaining means exposing the inner workings of a system that has operated privately for so long that the idea of making it visible to another person can feel like a breach. not of security in the technical sense, but of sovereignty. The money is his. The decisions are his. The logic is his. And making any of that legible to an outsider, even a trusted one, can feel like surrendering a domain that has been entirely self-governed for decades. This resistance is understandable. It is even, in a certain light, admirable. It reflects a man who takes ownership seriously, who does not delegate carelessly, who does not treat his financial life as a casual matter. But admirable resistance and structural risk are not mutually exclusive. A man can be right to value his financial privacy and still be wrong to assume that his private understanding will survive his unavailability. Now consider what happens at night when these systems intersect. The man is in bed, or standing in the kitchen, or sitting in the chair he has gradually made his primary seat because the other chairs require more effort to rise from than they used to. The house is quiet. The day's administrative tasks are either completed or deferred. The body is either comfortable or managing discomfort within its established tolerance. The finances are either in order or contain a discrepancy that has not yet surfaced because no one else is looking. And in this convergence, health managed alone, finances managed alone, household managed alone, administrative life managed alone, the architecture of the life becomes most visible, not because anything is failing, because everything is resting on the same single foundation: the man, his memory, his judgment, his energy, his initiative, his willingness to continue performing every function that a full domestic infrastructure requires. And as long as he performs, the system holds. The bills stay paid, the medications stay filled, the house stays maintained, the appointments stay kept, the food stays stocked, the insurance stays current. But the arrangement does not merely depend on him. The arrangement is him. There is no separation between the operator and the operation. They have merged. And that fusion, which in younger decades felt like efficiency, begins in later decades to feel like something else. Not a trap exactly, and not a burden he resents, but a recognition, arriving quietly and without announcement, that the distance between everything working and nothing working is exactly the width of one man's continued capacity. This recognition does not always arrive as fear. Sometimes it arrives as fatigue, a tiredness that is not physical but administrative. The low-grade weariness of being the only person who knows where everything is, how everything works, and what everything means. Sometimes it arrives as irritation, a flash of impatience at a form that asks for an emergency contact, the brief internal negotiation over whose name to write, the awareness that whoever he names may not actually know enough to function in a genuine emergency. Sometimes it arrives as arithmetic. A man calculates not his savings, but his timeline. How many years is he likely to remain at current capacity? How many years before the knee changes the mobility equation? How many years before the cognition question stops being hypothetical? The arithmetic is not morbid. It is the same kind of projection he has applied to every other system in his life. How long will the roof last? When does the car need replacing? How many years until the furnace becomes unreliable? He applies the same logic to himself, and the answer he arrives at is not alarming in any immediate sense, but it is specific. It has a range, and for the first time, the range is not expanding. There is a phrase that has carried many of these men through decades of solitary operation. I'll handle it. 3 words: reliable, proven, tested against 30 years of evidence. The car broke down. He handled it. The job was lost. He handled it. The roof leaked. He handled it. The tax situation became complicated. He handled it. The medical scare came and went. He handled it. These are not empty claims. They are documented history. The man has, in fact, handled it. Every time, without assistance, without complaint, without fanfare. And the phrase has become more than a response to individual problems. It has become a standing policy, a default orientation toward the world. Whatever arises, the answer is already known. He will handle it. The danger is not that the phrase was ever false. The danger is that it remains psychologically current after it has become structurally incomplete. Because handling things alone at 63 is not the same as handling things alone at 41. Not because the man is less intelligent, not because the man is less willing, but because the things that need handling have changed in character, and the body and mind that do the handling have changed in capacity. And the gap between those two trajectories does not announce itself. It widens quietly, the way a crack in a foundation widens. Not fast enough to trigger alarm, not slow enough to be irrelevant, just steadily enough that by the time the phrase, "I'll handle it," meets a situation it cannot resolve alone, the distance between expectation and reality may be larger than the man has prepared for. And there is no second voice in the house to say, "Maybe not this time." Chapter 4. The private bargain. There is a question that almost never gets asked directly, because asking it feels like an accusation. The question is this: what did you trade? Not what did you lose, not what went wrong, not what are you missing. Those are all questions that assume damage, and damage is not necessarily what happened here. The better framing is trade, because a trade implies agency. It implies that something was given in exchange for something received. And for most never-married men past 50, that is a more honest description of how the structure came to be than any narrative of failure or avoidance. Something was traded, and something was gained. The question is whether the full terms of the trade have ever been examined. Not at the moment the trade was made, because it was not made in a single moment, but now, decades later, when the terms have had time to compound. The trade, in its simplest form, looked something like this. On one side, freedom from compromise, freedom from negotiation, freedom from the daily friction of merging 2 lives, 2 sets of preferences, 2 financial philosophies. Freedom from negotiating how a house should be kept, how a weekend should be spent, how much proximity is enough. On the other side, a life in which no one else carries institutional knowledge. No one else holds the daily rhythm. No one else provides ambient monitoring of health, cognition, mood, and capacity. No one else shares the administrative burden. No one else is automatically notified, when the structure deviates from pattern. The first side of the trade is visible every day. It shows up in the clean counter, the undisturbed schedule, the freedom to eat at 9 or not eat at all, the quiet house that responds to one will only. The second side of the trade is invisible almost every day. It only becomes visible under specific conditions: illness, emergency, cognitive shift, legal complexity, financial disruption, or the slow narrowing of capacity that does not announce itself with a single event, but accumulates across months and years. This is what makes the trade so durable. The benefits are constant and present. The costs are intermittent and deferred. And any system in which benefits are immediate and costs are delayed will tend to sustain itself long past the point where the balance has shifted. Many of these men did not consciously choose this trade. That is important to say, because the implication that they chose isolation is one of the things that produces the most resistance. The suggestion that at some identifiable point they decided to be alone, that they weighed the options and picked solitude. This framing misrepresents what actually happened for most of them. What happened was incremental. A relationship ended in his late 20s. He took time to recover. The time extended. Work picked up. Another relationship began in his early 30s. It was serious for a while. Then it was not. The reasons were specific, and at the time, defensible. Incompatibility. Different goals. A move that one person was willing to make and the other was not. By his mid-30s, the pattern had begun to form, but it did not yet feel like a pattern. It felt like a sequence of individual outcomes, each one with its own explanation. By 40, the explanations had started to consolidate. He was selective. He valued his independence. He had seen enough bad marriages to know what he was avoiding. He was not opposed to partnership in theory. He simply had not found the right situation. These were not lies. They were accurate partial descriptions, each one true enough to be satisfying. None of them complete enough to capture the whole picture, because the whole picture included something harder to name. A gradual narrowing of the aperture through which another person could enter. Not a wall, exactly. More like a series of filters, each one reasonable on its own, that cumulatively reduced the likelihood of deep entanglement to something approaching zero. The filters were not dramatic. They were practical. She would need to understand that his time alone was not a problem to solve. She would need to accept that his household ran a certain way. She would need to be financially independent. She would need to not require constant emotional maintenance. She would need to be comfortable with his silences. She would need to not interpret his self-sufficiency as rejection. Each filter, stated plainly, sounds reasonable, mature, even. The kind of clarity that self-help books recommend. But filters accumulate. And at a certain density, a set of reasonable filters becomes a structure that admits almost no one, not because the man is unreasonable, but because the gap between his established life and any potential shared life has become so wide that crossing it would require a disruption he is no longer willing to absorb. The trade was never signed in one sitting. It was ratified in small daily increments, each one barely noticeable, until the cumulative effect became architectural. Now, this is the section where defensiveness peaks, because describing the trade is not the same as condemning it. A man can read everything above and feel, accurately, that much of it was intelligent, that avoiding a bad marriage was wise, that valuing autonomy was not a defect, that the relationships that ended were right to end, that the filters he developed were not pathological screens, but reasonable standards applied by a man who knew himself well enough to recognize poor fits before they became entrenched. All of that can be true. And it can also be true that the cumulative effect of those intelligent decisions produced a structure with specific late-life vulnerabilities that the decisions themselves did not anticipate both things at the same time. This is not a contradiction. It is a description of how complex systems work. The best decisions made at each individual stage can still produce an aggregate outcome that contains risks the individual stages could not foresee. A man who invested wisely at every step can still arrive at a portfolio that is concentrated in one sector, not because any single investment was wrong, but because the pattern was never examined as a whole. The same applies here. Each decision about relationships, about independence, about how much access to grant other people, each one may have been sound. But the portfolio of decisions, viewed from the vantage point of later life, reveals a concentration that no single decision intended. A concentration of function in one person. A concentration of knowledge in one mind. A concentration of witness in one pair of eyes. This is the point at which the identity question becomes unavoidable. For many men in this position, independence has become more than a lifestyle. It has become a core identity structure, something that holds the other pieces together, something that provides a stable answer to the question, who are you? He is the man who does not need. He is the man who figured it out on his own. He is the man who is not broken by the absence of partnership. He is the man who remained functional, dignified, capable, and intact without the scaffolding that most people require. His identity is not fragile in the ordinary sense. It has been tested by decades of evidence. It has survived social pressure, holiday interrogations, the quiet pity of relatives, the casual assumptions of coworkers, and the culture's persistent implication that unmarried men past a certain age are damaged goods. The man has withstood all of that and remained composed. That composure is genuine. It was earned. But earned composure and structural accuracy are not the same thing. A man can be genuinely composed and still be living inside a design that does not account for what happens when composure is no longer sufficient. When the issue is not whether he can remain calm, but whether someone else knows where the insurance documents are. When the question is not whether he can manage his emotions, but whether anyone would notice if he stopped managing his house. Identity, when it becomes architectural, creates a specific kind of blind spot. It does not prevent the man from seeing risk in the abstract. He is perfectly capable of understanding, intellectually, that a solitary structure has vulnerabilities. He may even acknowledge it in conversation, briefly, before redirecting to something more comfortable. But identity prevents the understanding from becoming operational, because making it operational actually building redundancy, actually sharing information, actually creating lines of visibility into his daily life, would feel like modifying the thing that holds him together. Not his house or his finances or his schedule, his sense of self. And a man will tolerate remarkable structural risk before he will voluntarily modify his sense of self. There is another layer here that rarely gets spoken about directly. For some men in this position, not all, but a significant number, the independence carries a private moral weight that goes beyond preference. It is not merely that he prefers autonomy. It is that autonomy has become evidence of his adequacy as a man. Proof that he did not fail the test that the culture, in its blunt way, sets for adult males. Provide for yourself. Manage your affairs. Do not become a burden. He passed that test. He has been passing it for decades. And passing it without a partner makes the achievement feel, in some private way, more complete. Because he did it without the domestic infrastructure that most men rely on. He did it without someone else managing the household, tracking the appointments, maintaining the social calendar, providing the emotional regulation that many men quietly depend on their partners to supply. He did it alone. And that aloneness is not just a circumstance. It is a credential. Admitting that the credential has a structural cost, that the same aloneness that proves his capability also reduces his resilience, is not an intellectual problem. He can follow the logic. He can see the argument. It is an identity problem, because the cost and the credential are made of the same material. Acknowledging the cost feels dangerously close to devaluing the credential. This is why external suggestions to get connected or build a support network land so poorly with this audience. The suggestions are not wrong in principle. They are wrong in framing. They frame connection as something the man is missing, which implies deficit. They frame support as something the man needs, which implies inadequacy. They frame network building as a corrective action, which implies that the current structure is a mistake. None of those framings are survivable for a man whose identity is built on not needing correction. The message that arrives is not "this would be helpful." The message that arrives is "you have been doing it wrong." And a man who has spent 30 years proving he was doing it right will reject that message before it finishes arriving. Not because he cannot hear it, because hearing it threatens the architecture that has been holding him upright. This rejection is not stubbornness in the simple sense. It is structural self-defense. The identity is protecting itself the same way any load-bearing system protects itself, by refusing modification that feels like it might cause collapse. But collapse is not what is being proposed. And this is the distinction that matters most in this entire examination. No one is suggesting that this man's life was built incorrectly. No one is suggesting that his decisions were wrong. No one is suggesting that he would have been happier, healthier, or more complete if he had married at 32 and raised children in a suburb. That alternative life has its own risks, its own concentrations, its own structural vulnerabilities. Marriage does not automatically produce resilience. Partnership does not automatically produce witness. Family does not automatically produce continuity planning. The point is not that his life should have been different. The point is that his life as it actually exists, contains a specific architectural feature that becomes more consequential with age. One operator, one observer, one decision maker, one memory system, one administrative authority, one health monitor, one financial manager, one person through whom every function of daily life must pass. That feature was manageable at 40. It was sustainable at 50. At 60 and beyond, it does not become impossible, but it becomes increasingly expensive in ways that are difficult to see from inside the system. And the difficulty of seeing it from inside is itself part of the architecture. Because the man who runs the system is the same man who would need to recognize that the system requires structural revision. And structural revision of something that has become identity is the hardest kind of revision there is. There is something else the house reveals at night, something more personal than systems analysis. It reveals what the man has not said, not to a therapist, not to a friend, not in a journal he does not keep, not in the conversations he does not have, because there is no one sitting across from him at the table at 8 in the evening. The things a man living this way has not said are not necessarily dramatic. They are not confessions of secret pain or buried regret. Often, they are ordinary observations that simply had no audience. The strange feeling that came over him at a nephew's wedding, not sadness exactly, but a kind of spatial disorientation, as if he were watching a custom that belonged to a language he understood but had never spoken. The moment at a hardware store when a man roughly his age asked his wife to hold one end of a board while he measured. The simple domesticity of it, the unthinking cooperation, produced a response he could not categorize and chose not to examine. The afternoon he realized he had not spoken a word out loud since the previous morning, not because he was depressed, because there had been no occasion. These are not crises. They are textures, the small, unreported data points of a life lived without continuous witness. They accumulate the way sediment accumulates, slowly, invisibly, without any single layer being heavy enough to notice. But sediment changes the depth of the water, and depth changes what the surface conceals. The house at night is an honest environment. It does not flatter. It does not accuse. It does not interpret. It simply holds whatever is there, the order and the silence, the competence and the concentration, the dignity and the exposure, the identity and the cost. And the man who stands in it at 2 in the morning is not failing. He is not broken. He is not in need of rescue or pity or a 5-step plan for social reconnection. He is living inside a structure that worked exceptionally well for a long time and is now approaching the phase of life in which its central design feature, singularity of operation, becomes its central design risk. That is not a moral judgment. It is an engineering observation. And like all engineering observations, it matters most when it is made before the load exceeds the capacity, not after. Chapter 5. Unwitnessed existence. The man does not think of himself as isolated. That word belongs to a clinical vocabulary he has no use for. It implies pathology. It implies that his condition has been observed, categorized, and assigned a severity. It implies that someone with a clipboard has looked at his life and found it deficient in a measurable way. He does not feel deficient. He feels operational. And operational, for most of his adult life, has been sufficient evidence that the structure is sound. But there is a difference between isolation as a feeling and isolation as a detection problem. A man can feel perfectly fine and still exist inside a system where deviation from normal takes an unusually long time to register, not because no one cares, but because the life has been arranged in a way that minimizes routine external contact to the point where absence and presence become nearly indistinguishable from the outside. Consider the mechanics of it. He goes to work or he does not. If he has retired, the work signal disappears entirely. No employer notices his absence on a given Tuesday. No colleague expects him in a meeting. No schedule holds a shape that would deform visibly if he were not there. He may have friends, but friendships among men of this age often operate on a rhythm measured in weeks or months, not days. A text unanswered for 5 days does not trigger concern. It triggers the assumption that he is busy or uninterested or simply being himself. He may have family, but family contact, particularly with siblings or extended relatives, often follows holidays and occasions rather than daily check-ins. A brother who has not heard from him in 2 weeks assumes nothing. 3 weeks, the same. A month might produce a casual call. Might. He may have neighbors. But neighboring in most American communities, particularly for men who do not socialize on their front porches, is a parallel existence more than an interlocking one. The neighbor sees the car in the driveway or does not. The neighbor waves or does not. The neighbor would eventually notice something dramatically wrong: an overflowing mailbox, a lawn unmowed for 6 weeks. But the threshold for noticing is remarkably high. Now add these intervals together. Work contact, possibly none. Friend contact, weekly to monthly. Family contact, monthly to seasonal. Neighbor contact, incidental. Medical contact, annual or less. The sum of these intervals defines something specific. It defines a detection window, the amount of time that could pass between an incapacitating event and someone else recognizing that something has gone wrong. For many never married men past 50 living alone, that detection window is not hours. It is days. In some cases, it is weeks. This is not a statement about how much he is loved. It is a statement about how his life is wired. The wiring does not include a circuit that trips automatically when he is no longer functioning. In most shared households, that circuit exists by default. A spouse who does not hear from her husband by dinner time calls. A child who sees the car still parked at noon knocks on the door. A partner who notices the bed was not slept in starts asking questions. In this house, the circuit does not exist. Not because it was removed, because it was never installed. Now extend this beyond emergency. The detection window does not only matter for catastrophic events. It matters for the slow-moving changes that are, in many ways, more dangerous, precisely because they do not trigger emergency responses. A man whose cognitive processing has slowed by 10% over 18 months will not collapse. He will not miss a mortgage payment. He will not forget his own name. He will simply become slightly less efficient in ways that are invisible from outside and nearly invisible from inside. He takes longer to complete tasks he used to handle quickly. He avoids certain kinds of paperwork, not because he cannot do them, but because they have become more effortful than they used to be. He drives familiar routes and avoids unfamiliar ones. He simplifies meals not out of preference, but out of a desire to reduce the number of decisions in a day. These adaptations are intelligent. They are the mind doing what minds do, conserving resources by narrowing scope. In a clinical setting, they might be recognized as early compensatory behavior. In a solitary household, they look like routine. They look like a man who likes what he likes and does not see the need to complicate things. No one challenges the narrowing because no one is close enough to see it as narrowing. It presents as stability. It presents as the settled preferences of a man who knows what works for him. And maybe that is all it is. Maybe the simplified meals really are a preference. Maybe the avoided routes really are indifference. Maybe the slower pace really is just a man who no longer feels the need to rush. But maybe not. And the structural problem is that, in this house, there is no one positioned to tell the difference. There is a particular cruelty in how competence disguises decline. A man who is always sharp appears sharp even when he has lost a step, because the baseline others remember is so high that the reduced version still exceeds average performance. No one worries about the man who is always the most organized person in the room. Even after his organization has started to depend on workarounds, he invented to compensate for changes he has not named. A man who is always private appears private, even when his privacy has shifted from preference to concealment. Not deliberate concealment, organic concealment. The kind that occurs when a man who never talked about his problems continues not talking about them. No one notices the difference between comfortable silence and silence that has become necessary because the problems are now harder to articulate. A man who is always self-reliant appears self-reliant even when his self-reliance is narrowed from a broad competence to a defended perimeter. He can still manage the things inside the perimeter, but the perimeter is smaller than it was 5 years ago, and the things outside it are being neglected or deferred in ways that would be visible to a regular observer but are invisible to the occasional one. Competence provides cover. High-functioning men in particular are protected by their own track records from the scrutiny that might otherwise surface early signs of change. The doctor who sees him once a year compares him to population norms, not to his own prior performance. The friend who sees him once a month sees a man who seems fine. The brother who calls at Christmas hears a voice that sounds the same as always. And the man himself compares his current capacity to his current demands, which he has quietly adjusted downward to match. The fit still feels adequate because he has tailored the demands to the capacity without recognizing that the tailoring itself is evidence. Now bring the financial structure back into focus under these conditions. A man whose cognition is subtly narrowing is still receiving the same financial correspondence, still facing the same account structures, the same tax obligations, the same insurance renewals, the same beneficiary designations, the same estate questions that he has been deferring for years because they seemed premature. But his relationship to these obligations is changing. Not dramatically, not in a way that produces immediate consequences, in a way that produces drift. The investment allocation that made sense 5 years ago has not been reviewed because reviewing it requires a level of sustained analytical focus that has become slightly more expensive. The insurance policy that should have been adjusted after his last birthday sits in a drawer. The act of calling the company, navigating the phone tree, requesting the forms, reading the fine print, and making a decision requires more consecutive steps than he wants to take on a Saturday. The will, if one exists, was drawn up at a time when his life looked different and has not been updated. The power of attorney, if one exists, may name someone who is no longer the right person, or no longer alive, or no longer in contact. The beneficiary on the retirement account may still list an ex-girlfriend from 2004. Changing, it requires logging into an account he has not accessed in years, and the password is stored nowhere but in a memory that is no longer as reliable as it once was. None of these are emergencies today. Each one is a deferred task that carries no immediate penalty. But the accumulation of deferred tasks in a system with no second reviewer creates a kind of administrative sediment. Layer by layer, the gap between the man's financial reality and his financial documentation widens, and the man does not see the gap. Because the gap exists in the space between what he knows in his head and what is written down in forms, in systems, in legal documents that would need to be interpretable by someone other than himself. The knowledge is intact, the records are incomplete, and the distance between those two conditions is the precise measure of the system's fragility. There is a moment that many men in this position have experienced but rarely describe. It happens during a routine errand, a visit to the bank, a phone call with an insurance company, a form at the doctor's office, a legal document that requires a signature and a witness. The moment is this: the form asks for a name, an emergency contact, a next of kin, a person authorized to make decisions, a person who should be notified, and the man pauses. Not for long, a few seconds. He writes a name, usually a sibling, sometimes a friend, occasionally a coworker who may or may not realize he has been designated for this role. But in that pause, something is briefly visible that is otherwise kept out of sight. The name he writes is not the name of someone who knows his daily patterns. It is not the name of someone who could walk into his house and find the insurance binder. It is not the name of someone who has been briefed on his medical history, his financial structure, his account passwords, his wishes in the event of incapacity. It is the name of someone who exists in his life, but does not exist inside his system. The form is satisfied. The space is filled. The bureaucratic requirement is met. But the underlying question, who actually holds operational knowledge of this man's life, remains unanswered. The form does not ask that question. No form does. Forms ask for names. They do not ask whether the name represents genuine functional access or merely the closest approximation of a connection that the man could produce in the moment. This is the quiet center of the destabilization, not a crisis or a collapse or a dramatic revelation. just a steady accumulation of evidence that the structure, while still standing, has been optimized for conditions that are slowly changing. The body is changing, not failing, changing, in ways that alter the cost of daily operations without yet altering the output. The mind is changing, not declining in a clinical sense necessarily, but shifting in ways that make certain tasks more effortful, certain decisions more deferrable, certain complexities more avoidable. The administrative environment is changing, more digital, more credential-gated, more layered with security protocols and verification steps that assume a continuity of access and memory that may not hold. The social environment is changing. Friends age out, move away, get absorbed into their own late-life concerns. The network, already thin, does not automatically replenish itself. Each lost connection reduces the already narrow band of people who might notice deviation. And through all of this, the man continues to function, continues to manage, continues to hold, because that is what the identity requires. But the identity was formed under different conditions. It was formed when the body cooperated without negotiation, when the mind processed without hesitation, when the future was long enough that structural questions about sustainability could be deferred indefinitely. Those conditions have changed. The identity has not. And so the private bargain, made incrementally over decades, arrives at its late life turns. The benefits remain. The house is still quiet. The schedule is still his own. The freedom from negotiation, from compromise, from the daily friction of shared existence, these are still real, still present, still functional. But the costs, which were always deferred, have begun to accumulate interest. No relational redundancy means no early warning system. No shared knowledge means no continuity plan. No regular witness means no external calibration of change. No designed handoff means no survivable transition if the single operator becomes unavailable. These costs do not arrive as a bill. They arrive as a narrowing, a gradual reduction in the margin between functioning and not functioning, a slow erosion of the buffer that once existed between a problem occurring and a problem being recognized. The man may sense this narrowing without naming it. He may feel it as a vague unease that visits in the early hours and leaves by morning. He may notice it as a reluctance to think too carefully about the next 10 years. He may experience it as a subtle shift in how the house feels at night, not unsafe, not unhappy, but somehow less sealed than it used to be. The silence has not changed. What has changed is what the silence contains. It used to contain peace. It still does, mostly. But now it also contains a question that peace alone cannot answer. If this man were to become less than fully operational, not dead, not dramatically incapacitated, but simply less, who would know, and how long would it take them to find out? The house holds this question the way it holds everything else, without urgency, without judgment, without any need for the man to respond tonight. But the question does not require his response in order to remain true. It is a structural fact, and structural facts do not expire because they go unacknowledged. They wait, the way a crack in a foundation waits, not with malice, not with agenda, just with patience, and with the certainty that eventually conditions will arrive that make the waiting unnecessary. Chapter 6. Quiet Reconstruction. Something has to shift now. Not in the man's life, necessarily. Not yet, but in the frame through which this life is being examined. Because if the examination stops at exposure, if it catalogs the risks, names the vulnerabilities, measures the detection windows, and then falls silent, it has done nothing more than confirm what the man already suspects and has chosen not to dwell on. He knows. At some level, in some compartment he does not open often, he knows. He knows the house is quiet in ways that carry weight. He knows the emergency contact on the form is a formality. He knows the passwords are in his head and nowhere else. He knows the will is outdated or non-existent. He knows that if he fell in the shower on a Thursday evening, the earliest plausible discovery would be Monday, maybe Tuesday. He knows. And knowing has not been sufficient to produce change, because knowing, for this man, is not the bottleneck. The bottleneck is that every available path toward change has been framed in a language that threatens his identity. Get help, build community, open up, let people in, be vulnerable. Each of these phrases, however well-intentioned, carries an implicit message. You are currently deficient, and the correction requires you to become someone other than who you are. That message will not work. It has not worked for years. It will not work tonight. So the frame has to shift. The shift begins with a simple restatement of the problem. The problem is not that this man is emotionally closed. The problem is not that he lacks social skills. The problem is not that he chose wrong at 28 or 35 or 42. The problem is not that he is afraid of intimacy, allergic to commitment, or psychologically defended against connection. The problem is an engineering problem. A life that runs every critical function through a single point has a concentration risk that increases as the node ages. That is not a personality flaw. It is a design characteristic. And design characteristics can be modified without dismantling the structure. A building with a single electrical feed does not need to be torn down and rebuilt with a different philosophy. It needs a second feed, a backup circuit, a transfer switch that activates when the primary line goes down. The building remains the same building. The architecture remains the same architecture. The owner remains the same owner with the same preferences, the same routines, the same relationship to his space. What changes is not the identity of the structure. What changes is its capacity to sustain interruption. That is the reframe. Not become a different person. Instead, make the existing design survivable under a wider range of conditions. This reframe matters because it respects something that most advice fails to respect. It respects the fact that this man built something, not by accident, not by default. Through decades of sustained effort, he built a life that functions. That life reflects his values, his preferences, his judgment, and his tolerance for complexity. It is not a ruin. It is not a half-life. It is a complete operating system that has performed reliably for a long time. The issue is not that the system is bad. The issue is that the design was optimized for a single failure mode, continued full operation of the primary user. And life, particularly late life, introduces failure modes that the original design did not anticipate. A man does not need a new life. He needs an updated specification. What does that look like in practice? It begins unexpectedly with paper, not with conversation, not with emotional disclosure, not with joining a group or calling a sibling or scheduling a lunch that feels performative and forced. It begins with writing things down: the location of accounts, the names of institutions, the passwords or the system by which passwords are generated, the insurance policies and their terms, the name of the doctor, the dentist, the accountant, the attorney, if there is one, the medications and their dosages, the property records, the car title, the mortgage documentation, the beneficiary designations, current or outdated, the recurring payments and their sources, the subscriptions, the debts, if any, the assets, wherever they sit, not for emotional catharsis, for operational continuity. The act of writing this down is not an admission of weakness. It is the same act that any competent operator performs when maintaining a complex system. It is documentation. It is what engineers call a runbook, the manual that allows someone other than the primary operator to understand and maintain the system in the event of the operator's absence. Every well-run server has one. Every well-maintained aircraft has one. Every business that expects to survive beyond its founder has one. A life is not less complex than any of these. The resistance to this step is real, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Writing it down makes it visible, and making it visible means acknowledging in concrete terms that the system might one day need to operate without him. That is not a hypothetical he enjoys. It is a confrontation with the one scenario his entire design was built to make unnecessary, the scenario in which he is not the one running things. For a man whose identity is built on operational control, documentation can feel like drafting the terms of his own obsolescence. Even if he understands, rationally, that a run book does not cause failure any more than a fire escape causes a fire, the emotional logic resists. Documentation makes the contingency real, and making the contingency real admits that the premise underlying the whole structure, that he will always be available to operate it, has an expiration date. That admission is not easy. It should not be treated as easy, but it is accurate. And accuracy for this audience carries more authority than comfort. The second step is designation, not intimacy, designation. Somewhere in this man's life, there is a person, possibly a sibling, possibly a longtime friend, possibly a nephew or niece, possibly a professional, who could serve as the secondary node, not a partner, not a confidant, not someone who needs to understand his emotional life or hear about his childhood. A secondary node, someone who holds a copy of the documentation, someone whose name appears on the legal forms not as a formality, but as a functional designation backed by actual information. Someone who could, if the need arose, walk into his house and locate the relevant documents within a reasonable time frame. Someone who has been told clearly and without excessive emotion where things are and what to do with them. This is not a request for closeness. It is a request for redundancy. The man does not need to become emotionally entangled with this person. He does not need to call them weekly. He does not need to disclose his inner life or process his past. He needs to hand them a folder, or give them access to a secure document, or sit with them for 90 minutes once a year and say, "Here is what has changed. Here is where things stand. If something happens, here is what you need to know." That is not vulnerability. That is maintenance. The distinction between vulnerability and maintenance is the distinction that makes all of this possible for this audience. Vulnerability asks the man to change how he feels. Maintenance asks him to change how his system is documented. Vulnerability asks him to open an emotional door he sealed decades ago for reasons that may have been perfectly sound. Maintenance asks him to open a filing cabinet and make sure the contents are legible to someone other than himself. These are not the same request, and conflating them is the reason most advice aimed at men in this position fails. The advice assumes that the barrier is emotional, that if the man could just feel differently about connection, about asking for help, about admitting need, the problem would resolve. But the barrier is not primarily emotional. It is architectural. The man has built a closed framework that functions well internally, but has no external interface. Adding an external interface does not require emotional transformation. It requires a design update. The difference matters enormously. A man who is asked to transform emotionally will resist, because transformation threatens identity. A man who is asked to update his system design may comply, because design updates are something he already understands and has been doing his whole life. He updates his insurance. He updates his will, or he should. He updates his appliances when they become inefficient. He updates his vehicle when repair costs exceed replacement value. Updating the operational architecture of his life is not a different kind of task. It is the same kind of task applied to a domain he has not yet included in his maintenance schedule. There is a third element that is harder to systematize, but no less structural. It is the question of traceability. A man can document his finances, designate a secondary contact, and still remain essentially invisible in his daily life. The documentation covers the administrative layer. The designation covers the emergency layer, but neither one addresses the ambient layer, the day-to-day question of whether anyone is aware, in a routine and unobtrusive way, that the man is continuing to function normally. Traceability does not require surveillance. It does not require check-in calls that feel infantilizing. It does not require a monitoring system that treats the man as a patient or a risk. It requires something simpler and more sustainable, a regular point of contact that creates a natural rhythm of expected communication. This can take many forms. A standing weekly phone call with a sibling that lasts 10 minutes and covers nothing of emotional depth. A Tuesday morning coffee with a neighbor that happens because of routine, not because of need. A recurring appointment, barber, gym, regular restaurant, where absence would be noticed within a short time frame. The content of the contact does not matter. What matters is the rhythm, because rhythm creates expectation, and expectation creates a detection threshold. If the man does not show up on Tuesday, someone notices by Wednesday. If the man does not answer the phone on Sunday, someone follows up by Monday. The detection window, which in the fully solitary structure could stretch to days or weeks, collapses to hours. Not because the man surrendered his privacy, because he introduced a structural cadence that serves the same function as a heartbeat monitor, not by measuring the details of his internal state, but by confirming at regular intervals that the system is still running. What this looks like in practice is deliberately unremarkable. It looks like a standing phone call every Sunday evening with a brother who lives 2 states away. The call lasts 12 minutes. They talk about weather, about football, about a cousin's business. They do not discuss feelings. They do not process childhood. They simply confirm, through the act of speaking, that both ends of the line are functioning normally. It looks like a weekly trip to the same barbershop, where the barber has come to expect him on Saturday mornings. If he does not show, the barber will not call, but the barber will notice. And noticing is the first step in a chain that could, under the right circumstances, shorten a detection window from 2 weeks to 2 days. It looks like a neighbor who has been given a key, not with ceremony, not with a conversation about vulnerability or aging or contingency planning, just a practical exchange mentioned casually, in case you ever get locked out, in case I ever need someone to check the furnace while I am out of town. The key sits in the neighbor's kitchen drawer, inert and largely forgotten, but it exists. And its existence means that the house is no longer a sealed container accessible to one person only. None of these arrangements require emotional transformation. None of them require the man to become someone he is not. Each one is small, practical, and fully compatible with the identity he has built over a lifetime. And each one, in its modest way, closes a gap that the original design left open. There is a version of this that some men arrive at naturally. They do not frame it in structural terms. They would not use the word redundancy or traceability. They would say they have their routines. They see the same people at the same places on the same days. They have their spots, their regulars. And without any formal analysis, they have built exactly the kind of ambient detection network that the fully solitary structure lacks. The man at the diner on Saturday morning, whose absence would prompt the waitress to mention it to the owner. The man at the hardware store every other weekend, whose disappearance would register with the clerk who always helps him. The man who walks the same route at the same time, and whose neighbors have internalized the rhythm without being asked to. These men did not read a manual. They followed an instinct for social anchoring that operates below conscious strategy. And the result is a life that retains its independence while introducing just enough external rhythm to prevent the silence from becoming absolute. The question is whether the man who has not built these rhythms naturally can build them deliberately. The answer is yes, but only if the framing is correct. Not, you need to get out more. That framing implies deficit. Instead, your system currently has no automatic notification if it goes offline. Here is how to add one without changing the system. The language matters. The framing matters. The preservation of agency and dignity matters. because a man who feels he is being improved will resist. A man who feels he is improving his own infrastructure may act. There is something else that must be addressed before the reconstruction is complete. The home itself. The house has been discussed as a diagnostic instrument, a space that reveals, in its silence, the design of the life within it. But the house also has a forward-looking function. It is the environment in which the man will age, and the way it is arranged, physically and administratively, will determine whether that aging is absorbed gracefully or whether it produces compounding difficulties. This is not about downsizing or moving to assisted living. Those conversations belong to a later stage, if they belong at all. This is about looking at the house with the same engineering eye that has already been applied to the financial and social structures. Where are the fall risks? Not hypothetically, physically. The rug at the top of the stairs, the bathroom without a grab bar, the basement stairs with a railing that has been loose for 2 years, the kitchen shelf that requires a step stool he does not always use carefully. Where are the access points? If emergency services needed to enter, how would they? Does someone else have a key? Does the door have a lockbox? Is there a way in that does not require breaking glass? Where is the critical information stored physically? If a paramedic arrived, would they find a medication list, a doctor's name, an allergy notation, an insurance card? Would they find it quickly, or would they have to search a house whose organizational logic is known to one person only? These are not traumatic preparations. They are the household equivalent of the documentation step. They are the physical run book, and they carry the same quiet benefit, not that they prevent crisis, but that they reduce the cost of crisis when it arrives. A man who completes these steps, documentation, designation, traceability, home assessment, has not surrendered his independence. He has done something more precise than that. He has separated independence from singularity of operation. Independence means he continues to make his own decisions, manage his own time, arrange his own life according to his own preferences. That does not change. Singularity means that he is the only person who can operate, interpret, or sustain the system. That is what changes. The distinction is the key to the entire reconstruction, because singularity was never a requirement of independence. It was a byproduct, an unintended consequence of decades spent building a system that worked so well with one operator that the need for a second operator never became visible. Now it is visible, not because the man failed, because time has changed the operating conditions. And the appropriate response to changed operating conditions is not regret. It is not self-criticism. It is not a re-examination of every decision that led to this point. It is an update, performed with the same competence, the same clarity, and the same quiet authority that built the system in the first place. Chapter 7. Return to the night house. The house is quiet again. Same hour, same kitchen, same glass of water at the sink. The refrigerator compressor cycles off. The heating system settles. The pipe inside the wall shifts once, holds, and goes still. Nothing about the scene has changed. The man is standing where he stood before. The hallway is dark. The bedroom door is open. No second lamp, No voice from the other room. No footsteps. No one asking if he is awake. The house is the same house, but the reading is different now. At the beginning of this examination, the silence appeared neutral, maybe even admirable. A man alone in a quiet, well-maintained home at 2 in the morning. A picture of composure. A life that did not need external validation to hold its shape. That reading was not false. It was incomplete. The silence was never just silence. It was data. It was the sound of a structure revealing its own design specifications under the one condition that makes them most legible: the absence of distraction. During the day, the house cooperates. It fills with activity, with task noise, with the sounds of function. The man and his environment are synchronized. He moves through it and it responds. The system hums. At night, the system goes quiet. And in the quiet, the architecture becomes visible in the same way that a building's frame becomes visible when the walls are stripped away. Not because something has been damaged, because the covering has been removed. What the silence revealed was not loneliness, not failure, not a life that should have been lived differently. It revealed concentration, a life in which every essential function, health monitoring, financial management, administrative continuity, household maintenance, decision authority, emergency response, and the simple daily confirmation that the system is still running passes through a single point. That single point is the man. And the man, like every man, is not permanent. This is not a morbid observation. It is the same observation that governs every other system he has ever managed. He would not run a furnace for 25 years without checking the heat exchanger. He would not drive a vehicle past 200,000 miles without acknowledging that certain components are now operating beyond their original service life. He would not maintain a roof by assuming that because it has not leaked yet, it will not leak next year. He applies engineering logic to every physical system in his care: the house, the car, the appliances, the yard infrastructure, the plumbing. He has simply not yet applied it to the one system that matters most, the operating architecture of his own life. And the reason he has not applied it is not ignorance. It is identity, because the operating architecture of his life is not separate from who he is. It is who he is. The way he runs things, the way he holds everything in one mind, the way he needs no one to manage what he has built, these are not just habits. They are the evidence he presents to himself and to the world that his life was built correctly. Revising the architecture can feel like revising the verdict, but it is not. The verdict stands. The life was built with discipline, intelligence, and sustained effort. The decisions were made with the best information available at the time. The structure held. It held for a long time. In many respects, it held better than structures that appeared more conventional and more supported. None of that is being challenged. What is being proposed is narrower and more specific than a challenge. It is a recognition that the operating conditions under which the structure was built have shifted. The body has changed. The administrative environment has changed. The cognitive margin has changed. The timeline has changed. And when conditions change, A well-built system does not ignore the change. It incorporates it, not by abandoning its original logic, but by extending that logic to cover the new parameters. That is not weakness. That is the definition of adaptive engineering. There is a fear that operates beneath the surface of this entire discussion, and it deserves to be named directly. The fear is not death. Men in this position have generally made their peace with mortality in the abstract. They may not have completed the paperwork, but the concept itself does not paralyze them. The fear is not loneliness either. They have lived with solitude long enough to have mapped its terrain. They know its rhythms. They know which hours carry weight and which ones pass without notice. They are not afraid of being alone. They have proven year after year that they can be alone without being destroyed by it. The fear, when it surfaces at all, is more specific than either of those. It is the fear of being found, not found in the rescue sense, found in the exposure sense, found in a state that contradicts the image they have maintained, found confused or incapacitated or surrounded by evidence of a decline they had been managing privately, found in a way that rewrites the story from competence to fragility, from independence to helplessness, from a man who had it together to a man who was barely holding on. That fear is not irrational. It is rooted in a lifetime of observation. They have seen how the world treats men who lose control of their narrative. The pitying tone, the second guessing, the relatives who arrive with plans already made, the conversations that happen in other rooms. They do not want to become that story. And so the structure stays closed. The information stays centralized. The daily life stays private. The system continues to run on one operator, not because the man has failed to understand the risk, but because the alternative, making the system visible to others, feels like an early draft of the very story he is trying to prevent. But here is the structural truth that resolves the fear. A man who documents his arrangement, designates a secondary node, and introduces basic traceability into his routine is not making himself vulnerable to that story. He is making that story less likely. Because the story he fears, being found in a state of undiscovered decline, is precisely the story that the closed system produces. It is the natural endpoint of a structure with no external interface, no witness, no detection rhythm, no one who holds enough information to intervene early when intervention is minor and dignity is easily preserved. The man who keeps everything sealed does not prevent the feared outcome. He guarantees that if it occurs, it will be discovered late, managed by strangers, and interpreted without context. The man who opens a narrow, controlled channel of visibility does the opposite. He ensures that deviation is caught early. That intervention, if needed, happens while he still has authority and voice. That the narrative remains his own because he built the communication structure rather than leaving it to chance. Privacy without design is not protection. It is delay. And delay, in the context of aging alone, does not preserve dignity. It transfers the loss of dignity to a later date and a less controlled setting. Designed visibility is the mechanism by which a man retains authorship of his own story, even under conditions he did not choose. The house is still quiet. The water glass sits on the counter. The hallway is still dark. The hour has not changed. But the man standing here, if he has followed the examination this far, is holding something he was not holding before. Not a plan, exactly. Not a resolution in the motivational sense. Not a warm feeling of connection or a sudden desire to call someone and share what he has been carrying. Something more precise than any of those. He is holding a more accurate description of his own structure. A description that does not flatter and does not accuse. A description that acknowledges what works and identifies with specificity, where the design becomes exposed under conditions that are no longer hypothetical. That description is not comfortable. It was not meant to be comfortable. Comfort is what the old reading provided. The old reading said, the house is quiet, the man is capable, the structure holds. And all of that was true. But it was true the way a quarterly report is true. It captured the current snapshot without modeling the forward risk. The new reading adds the forward risk, not as catastrophe, not as certainty, as probability, as a structural feature of a system that has operated at extraordinary efficiency for decades, but has done so by concentrating every function in a single aging node. And the question the new reading asks is not whether the man has lived well. He has. The question is whether the structure he built can hold its shape under conditions he has not yet faced. Whether the quiet house, the orderly finances, the managed health, the stable routines, whether all of it can survive the one event that every solitary system must eventually confront. The temporary absence of the man who makes it work, not permanent absence. That is a different question, and it has a simpler answer. Permanent absence ends the system. That is understood. Temporary absence, the hospitalization, the cognitive change, the recovery period, the weeks when he cannot manage at full capacity, is the harder scenario. Because the system does not end. It continues, but it continues without its operator. And what happens in that gap depends entirely on what was built before the gap appeared. If nothing was built, a gap fills with confusion. Other people, well-meaning, uninformed, attempt to reconstruct a life they do not understand from evidence they cannot read. Decisions get made by default rather than by design. The man's preferences, his logic, his carefully maintained order, all of it becomes noise in someone else's triage. If something was built, documentation, designation, a minimum viable network of awareness, the gap is managed. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but within parameters the man himself established, using information he chose to make available, following a logic he authored. The difference between those two outcomes is not dramatic. It is not the difference between tragedy and triumph. It is the difference between a system that was finished and a system that was only running. He puts the glass in the sink. He stands for one more moment. The house holds its silence. The clock on the microwave shows the time in green digits. The window over the sink reflects the kitchen back at him, his shape outlined against the dark cabinets, the light above the stove casting a low glow across the counter. He is not in crisis. He is not at a turning point in the dramatic sense. Nothing will change tonight. Probably nothing will change this week, but something has been measured that was not measured before. A dimension of his life that was always present, but never examined under these specific conditions. Not the emotional dimension, not the biographical dimension, the structural dimension. The engineering layer underneath the identity, underneath the pride, underneath the decades of successful solitary operation. And what the measurement shows is not that the structure has failed. It shows that the structure was built for one, that it has run on one, that it has succeeded on one, and that it remains, after all these years, dependent on one. The man is that one. He has been that one for a long time. The question is not whether he can continue to be that one. Tonight, he can. Tomorrow, almost certainly. Next year, probably. For a while yet, the system will hold because the man will hold. The question is what exists when he does not? Not what exists emotionally or philosophically. What exists structurally, practically, legibly, whether the life he built can be read by someone other than its author. He turns off the light above the stove. The kitchen goes dark. The hallway is a shadow. The bedroom door is still open. He walks back to bed. The house settles around him the way it always has. Familiar. Contained. His. The silence is not making an argument about loneliness. It never was. It is identifying whether a man's life remains visible, readable, and durable when no one else is there to notice. That is all it has ever been doing. And now, at least, the question has been heard. What happens next is a matter of engineering.